majesty, there is no second. America was your girl. She proves to be a mixed blessing as a blockade runner for the Confederates. DuPont and Stevens believed, having recaptured America, the best thing to do would be to send this iconic yacht north. Thank you all for coming out tonight. So yeah, I'm going to speak about this book, The Last Days of the Schooner America. It came out in August of 2024. There's some copies here. I'm happy to sign them afterwards. There's some copies for sale. Maybe you brought your own copy, etc. This book was, a couple decades in the making, to be honest with you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about America's story, or a lot about America's story, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the book because people find it interesting how it came together. So I co-founded Spin Sheet Magazine, which is a sailing magazine based in Annapolis. You can find it around here, down along the waterfront. Free monthly sailing magazine. And I loved history, and I loved researching history and writing about history. Well, once the word gets out that there's a 20-something young man that has a platform of a magazine that's interested in history, you can imagine who starts showing up at my door, right? A lot of the graybeards of Annapolis start showing up. You should write about the 1958 Annapolis to Newport race, that sort of thing. And I loved it, and I got a lot of great story ideas. Well, one day a gentleman walked in by the name of Fred Hecklinger. Some of you may recognize that name. He was a marine surveyor and did some work down here. And Fred had a hunk of wood with him, and he slammed it down, put it down pretty hard on my desk and said, "This is a piece of the true cross." And I said, "Fred, what are you talking about?" And he said, "It's a piece of the schooner yacht America. She was broken up right over there." And he pointed across the way. And he said, "It's a story you should look into." And I began to look into it. And what I found was just an amazing 90-year career of this racing schooner that ended very inauspiciously in the Eastport section of Annapolis, where she was broken up. So spoiler alert, America is not with us anymore. There are bits of her literally in this building, but the schooner itself, she is not. So as I began researching the story, what I learned was that America, of the America's Cup fame, the trophy named after the vessel, America, lots of research, lots of writing, lots of focus on August 22nd, 1851. That was the day that America won that race off the southern coast of England, as depicted in this image here by Russ Kramer. And that was the day that the owners won the cup that became America's Cup. There were books and books about this. There were hundreds of thousands of words about this. And I'm going to talk about it in a couple of minutes, almost fetishized. Like people, they know exactly what the timeline of that day. They know what everybody had for lunch. They know what people were wearing. But what happened after that race, the next 90 years of her career, very sparsely written about. And a lot of what was out there, I quickly learned, was just legend and probably not even true. So the book, when I set out to do it, I had to talk about that 1851 race, and we'll talk about that here this evening. But what I really focused on was what happened next. And what I really focused on was the last days of the schooner America, which was her time in the Annapolis, in the Eastport section of Annapolis. So what we have here is a contemporary painting by Russ Kramer, who is an amazing artist based in Mystic, Connecticut. And I highly recommend, if you need some inspiration or you want to see some beauty, just go to his website, and he has dozens of paintings like this of historic vessels, which are impeccably put together. So this is the schooner yacht America on August 22nd, 1851, racing off the Isle of Wight on the southern coast of England. For those of you that have been there before, you'll recognize the Needles up there, which is a geological figure right there that is part of the race course. So this is the schooner yacht America. I'll point out a couple of things, which we will circle back to as we go along. She steered with a tiller. Very odd for a 100-foot-long schooner to be steered with a tiller. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. She's got this lovely carved gold gilded eagle across the width of her stern, which is lovely. She's not sailed by very many people. That's a relatively small crew. All Americans on the crew there. And what you can see in the cockpit, and somebody made kind of a funny comment on social media about this They said, why are they sailing backwards? Well, she's so far ahead in the race that the afterguard there in the cockpit are looking back at the second place vessel. So this is the image that actually gets used on the cover of the book. Russ Kramer gave permission for that. So I think that's a great way to start. This is America in her first race, winning the trophy that is eventually named after her. This is a 70-foot wooden patrol torpedo boat built in Annapolis, running at speed in the Chesapeake Bay. What in the world does the Schooner Yacht America and a 70-foot World War II patrol torpedo boat have in common? Well, it turns out a lot, and we will hit that in the next hour or 45 minutes or so. So let's talk about America first. So this is the Schooner Yacht America being built in Lower Manhattan. So we had a group of New York City sportsmen, very wealthy men who loved betting on sports. They liked horse racing, they liked darts, they liked billiards, they loved yacht racing. And there was a lot of yacht racing that happened in New York Harbor in around 1850. So the Schooner Yacht America was built for a syndicate of New York sailors, specifically for sport, but also to take on other yachts for money. This was going to be a sporting thing that involved some gambling. There was no NFL at that point. There was no fantasy football, anything like that. So if you had a lot of money and you liked gambling, you would build yachts and race them against each other. Well, as America was being built, I will tell you, no expense spared. This was designed. These were men with a very open checkbook. They got the best young yacht designer that they could find, named George Steers. They got the best boat builder that they could find in Manhattan, named William Brown. They hired the best boat captain, a man from Mystic, Connecticut, named Richard Brown, who is known as Old Dick Brown. We'll get back to Old Dick Brown in a few minutes. So even as America is being built in Lower Manhattan, she is attracting attention on both sides of the Atlantic. So before she's even finished, a letter arrives from England. And it says, from the Royal Yacht Squadron, the Commodore, and it invites the Americans to take their schooner across the Atlantic and compete against the British fleet. Now, this was a very big deal for a couple of reasons. No yacht had ever crossed an ocean specifically to race, right? Why do you cross oceans? To trade, to have wars, to immigrate, et cetera. But the idea that you would move a yacht across an ocean just for the purposes of sport was kind of a foreign concept. The second reason that this was especially interesting was these were very much, these were men of a very high reputation. These were men that they would have known their names in the yachting circles in England. So the warm invitation arrives from the Royal Yacht Squadron. We understand you have a yacht under construction in Manhattan. Please extend we would warmly welcome you on the south coast of England to race against our fleet this summer, anytime you have an open invitation. So this is a pretty big deal. The Americans immediately accept the invitation, and it becomes news that this is a vessel that the upstart United States is going to send across the Atlantic to race against the finest racing yachts in the world. Even the very name of this yacht, America, spoke to the ambition of these men. So again, it was very newsworthy on both sides of the Atlantic. Here she is getting launched into the East River. A little bit of artistic license there, but you get the idea. So she's launched in May of 1851. This is where the shipyard is today. So it is roughly where 11th and 12th Street meet the East River. There is no sign of it anymore at all. I've walked around down there. There's not even a plaque, but this is where the William Brown shipyard was located on the East River. This is Melbourne Smith's depiction of what America looked like in racing trim right out of the gate. I will point a couple of things out here. Very simply rigged. And I mentioned earlier, not a lot of sailors on the deck. You did not have the big square rig sails that some of the other vessels had. You did not have the very complicated rigging that some of the other vessels had. This was a gaff-rigged schooner with one simple jib boom up in front. The lines were taken from the New York pilot boats. So these were the boats in New York City that would sail out offshore all the way to the Grand Banks to meet incoming ships and escort them into New York City. So what were some of the characteristics that those pilot ships had to have? They needed to be fast because the first one that got there got the job. They also needed to be seaworthy because they were sailing in blue water, right? They need to be fast and seaworthy. So America's lines, and the lines that George Steers drew on her, were very much inspired by those pilot boats, who were inspired in turn by the Baltimore Clippers of a generation earlier. So long, flat runs aft, a very sharp bow, very cleanly and simply rigged. Nothing fancy about America. However, again, what went into her construction, no expense spared. The finest sails, the finest materials. This vessel had a very specific design brief, but it was also incredibly ambitious. She needed to be stiff and sturdy enough to cross the Atlantic on her own keel. She needed to be fast enough to win a round the buoys race or a close inshore race. She had to be clean enough and pulled together enough that these very wealthy men and their friends would feel comfortable on board, right? This could not be a stripped out racing boat. So pretty simple, 3 things, but also incredibly complicated. So America makes her way across the Atlantic Ocean, the first yacht ever to cross for the purposes of a race. Peter Boudreau painted this a couple of years ago. He was a Pride of Baltimore captain and builder of a number of schooners. He's painting in his retirement. He did this lovely picture of America crossing. What I would point out about this crossing was America did it in 19 days. Now let's give some perspective. A passenger-carrying sailing ship of the same era took almost 40 days to do this on average. The fastest steamships that existed took 11 or 12 days. America went across with a delivery crew in 19 days. I know we probably have a few sailboat racers here, and we know how sailboat racers protect their racing sails. To give you an example of the no expense spared program, America's racing sails were stored below decks on this delivery. She had delivery sails and she had racing sails. So they were rolled and stored in the dark carefully down below, and these were her delivery sails that she went on. So here's America making her way across and gets to England. The word begins to spread of America's speed over there, and they're having a hard time finding anyone to race against them for money. So it's beginning to look like it's going to be a tricky, tough summer. We built this yacht, sailed her across. She's pretty fast. No one wants to line up against her for money. Finally, the Royal Yacht Squadron begins to feel bad for the Americans. And there's some great stories about how this happens, and I write about them in the book, but we know that America was fast. I can't help myself but tell you a couple. And we know how sailors get. There was a rumor going around the docks in Cowes that there was a secret propeller down below that made her so fast. And the crew, Mystic, Connecticut men largely, hired by Dick Brown, loved to play into this. So when spectators would come and row around America when she was at her mooring to get a closer look, they would say the word propeller occasionally, loud enough to be heard. When special guests would visit the yacht and get a tour from the owners, the sailors, the crew would go, "Oh, you're not allowed to look in that hatch. You know, that's off limits." And then my favorite was they would even in the pubs at Cowes on the Isle of Wight, when they knew they were being overheard, would say the word propeller occasionally just to be overheard. But there was no denying that America was blazingly fast. The Royal Yacht Squadron, feeling bad that nobody wants to challenge her for money, says, "Hey, we've got a regatta on Saturday, August 22nd. It goes around the Isle of Wight. It's 50 plus miles, all points of sail represented. If you'd like to enter that, you can be our guest." And of course, they entered that regatta, that race around the Isle of Wight, and everybody knows what happened. They crushed the competition. How bad did they crush the competition in that race? Well, Queen Victoria was there on the scene on the Royal Yacht, and she asked a signalman, "Young man, who's winning the race?" And he pulls up his telescope and looks and says, "Your Majesty, the American vessel's winning the race." And she said, "Well, who is in second?" And he replies, "Your Majesty, there is no second." Which is a slogan that I've even seen here in the galleries. That's a slogan that's around. Just to show you how specific people get about this 1851 race, there is a new book out written by a British author that specifically writes about that exchange. So it's like, who could the signalman have been? What were they eating for lunch? Would he really have answered that candidly to the Queen, et cetera? So all aspects of this race have really been deeply analyzed. For their after the race, Queen Victoria visits the yacht. She climbs aboard. Now let's look at this 1902 painting with a little bit of a more careful eye. You'll notice that this shows her with a wheel. Everything else we've seen so far has a tiller. Well, first of all, this is incorrect because she was fitted with a tiller the day of the race. But I mentioned the technological breakthroughs on America. She actually could be converted from a tiller to a wheel very quickly, depending on what they needed. So when she's going offshore, racing or sailing across the Atlantic on a delivery, she could be steered by a wheel. When she's in close quarters racing, the more immediate responsiveness of a tiller, she could be converted over to a tiller fairly quickly by her crew. Not during the race, right? But it was a process. We don't know exactly what that machinery looked like. We can envision it, but she could be converted back and forth from tiller to wheel. Pretty remarkable when you think about it. A couple stories around this Queen Victoria visit, though. You know, the Queen knew her way around yachts, and she is said to have run a white-gloved royal hand along a shelf and been impressed that there was no dust or dirt on it. Of course, that story comes from the sailing crew, who was in charge of keeping the yacht clean. She also commented on the way the ballast was stowed. America, instead of having just ingots or hunks of lead, or stones even, like a lot of vessels would have as ballast, America, no expense spared, had lead ballast that was shaped to the shape of the bilge to get as much in there and as low as possible. She made a comment about that. So either she was really up on her yachts or was well coached. I'm guessing she was really up on her yachts. So the Queen was very impressed. Prince Albert, on the other hand, the royal consort, was about to step aboard behind her, and Captain Dick Brown raised his hand and said, was about to say something, and the prince began to say, "Do you know who I am?" And Dick Brown said, "Sir, I know exactly who you are, but you have to remove your shoes." So we have those great legends coming from that 1851 race. Well, for their trouble, they didn't win any money, but they were presented with a silver cup, pictured here on the right. The cup is named after the yacht. So America's Cup with that possessive apostrophe S at the end, right? So not named after the nation, it's named after the yacht. So this cup that they got was probably, I mean, it was nice. It came from the Queen's jeweler in London, presented by the Royal Yacht Squadron. But the New York Syndicate was looking to make money off this, not to win another trophy or another cup. The cup makes its way back to Manhattan on a steamship, and it drops out of our story here. You know, again, there are oceans of ink written about the America's Cup up to this day, but it drops out of our story. It goes into storage in Manhattan. A few years later, it's pulled out of storage. There was a celebratory dinner for it. There was a proposal that we melt it down and make medals for everybody that was involved in the campaign. Ultimately, a deed was written, and the cup was given to the New York Yacht Club, and challengers were invited from the international community to race against her, and the New York Yacht Club held the America's Cup until 1983, right? So a lot of great history around that event. This is what it looked like in 1987 when Dennis Conner went to Australia to win it and brought it back, and this is in the East Room of the White House. So again, we're not here tonight to talk about the America's Cup, although I just spent 5 minutes talking about it. You can't tell America's story without the cup. But let's now, the cup is in Manhattan, and the next generation of yachts are going to race for it. It's still raced for. Let's talk about what happens to our girl from here. So the owners leave her behind. They return back to the United States on a steamship, and America gets sold to a local British yachtsman who immediately finds her to be a little bit too racy. He cuts down the spars. He adds ballast. He slows her down a little bit. He enters in some races. England, Great Britain gets involved in the Crimean War. So the yachting scene grinds to a halt and then stops. America gets sold and sold again. And just less than 10 years after that famous victory, she's abandoned on a mudflat. A yacht carpenter buys her, as is condition, and gets her going again and refits her and gets her going again. So she's now on her fourth owner in less than 10 years in England. Again, the yachting scene got very anemic during the Crimean War. Well, enter in 1860, an Irishman shows up, and he's a bit shady, and by I say shady, I don't mean well, you'll find he's a little bit shady. He also is a bit mysterious. We don't know a lot about this guy. His name is Henry Deasy, or maybe Dacey, or maybe Darcy. We don't really know a lot about this guy. But he shows up with a bill of sale that he has bought America. And it's a legal bill of sale. And she is registered in his name. And he takes America back across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. We don't know what was motivating him. Was he looking for adventure? Was he looking for a way to resell the yacht somewhere else? We do know that he was involved with the Confederacy. So he makes his way back to the United States, the southeast coast specifically, right in here specifically, and he rolls into Savannah with America. And he immediately gets in touch with the Confederate Navy. And we believe all signs indicate that she was actually sold to the Confederate Navy by Henry Deasy. He stayed aboard. Now, museum folks here and history folks here know the Confederate Navy records are a little bit spotty, right? It's nothing like the United States Navy records from the same time. So we were able to piece together that America is running blockades here on the southeast coast of the United States. She proves to be a mixed blessing as a blockade runner for the Confederates. She's painted black. She's fast as heck still, probably one of the fastest yachts in the world. She does need wind to move. She does not have a lot of room below, so she's not going to carry large quantities of things. But if you needed to move people, if you needed to move information, if you needed to move small quantities of valuable things, America was your girl. We do not have a lot of records of things. We do know she was operating between Nassau and Jacksonville, tended to be the route that she was on. So Jacksonville, during the war, is an interesting can of worms. And, you know, little did I know I would learn about Samuel DuPont and the Anaconda strategy, researching a Schooner America book. But in brief, to get to Jacksonville, you enter at Mayport, which during the Civil War had a big sandbar in front, so it was only accessible in certain conditions. Then you sailed 20 plus miles, or you made your way 20 plus miles up the winding St. Johns River to get to Jacksonville. So it is possible that as America is running blockades here, there's a risk that if she's inside when the Union finally gets here, she's trapped inside. Or if she's outside when the Union finally gets there, she's outside, and there's no going back. Well, it turns out that when Thomas Stevens, a United States Navy officer, leads the invasion of Jacksonville and takes it without a gun being fired, America was on the inside. So that we have our schooner yacht, sailed and owned by Confederates, stuck in the St. Johns River as the Union Navy is making their way in. So this is where our story takes its first sort of tabloid turn. Rather than having the iconic schooner yacht just handed over back to the United States, the Confederates, in the panic as Jacksonville is falling, grab a local teenager named Charles Hemmings, and he knows the river well, and they tell him, take America up the St. Johns River as far as you can go and hide her, because we can't have the Union Navy know that she's here. So he takes her more than 55 miles up this river, up these twists and turns, above the small town of Palatka. And finally, right here on Dunn's Creek, 55 miles from Jacksonville, he makes his attempt to hide America. So the idea was not to scuttle America, was not to light her on fire or ruin her. It was just to hide her until there was a chance to get her back out. So young Hemmings has a plan. He drills some holes in the hull to sink her. And then later, they would go back, plug those holes, pump her out, and she would go. You know, a little worse for wear, but there we go. Well, the bit of water that he selected to sink her in was quite shallow. She did not make it the whole way down. Spoiler alert, Thomas Stevens makes his way up there and collects America, refloats her, and returns her back to the United States. Samuel DuPont, his commanding officer from Port Royal, which is where Hilton Head is today, writes him a letter that says, congratulations on this interesting service. So both men believed, DuPont and Stevens believed, having recaptured America, the best thing to do would be to send this iconic yacht north. Let's get up to New York, maybe to Newport, where the Naval Academy had been moved during the Civil War to get it away from the South. Let's get America out of harm's way. Both of these gentlemen, Thomas Stevens and Samuel DuPont, and indeed almost every American naval officer knew the story of America in 1851. We covered that ground a few minutes ago. It was a big news event. So America being recaptured by the United States Navy is a big deal, right? It's a big deal. Well, DuPont on this blockade off Charleston is chronically short of ships at this point. So America does not get respite. America gets a cannon mounted on her bow, and she begins enforcing the blockade at Charleston, right off Rattlesnake Shoal, right off Isle of Palms. She's involved in several chases. She's involved in several captures. I write about them in the book. You know, she serves very honorably under a great captain named Jonathan Baker. You want to have a challenge, researchers, you know, try to research a Navy personnel named Jonathan Baker in the 1860s, right? There are hundreds of them. I think I found him. He's from Cape Cod, I think. So this is a depiction of America on the blockade. Finally, after almost a year on the blockade, she is sent north to the Charlestown Navy Yard for a refit. We believe this is the first photograph of America. No one's been able to find one earlier than this. I will point out in the background are the practice ships Marion, the battleship Ohio in the background. Let's just take a look at a couple features here. Those dramatically raked masts, not quite as dramatically raked as they were in 1851, but those raked masts, that long, lean stern we saw earlier, you know, not designed to carry cargo, but that long, lean stern. So this is believed to be the oldest existing picture of the schooner yacht America. The war ends, and America makes its way south. So here's America leaving Newport, Rhode Island, leading the fleet back to Annapolis, the Constitution there. She's crossing the bow of the Constitution. The Marion and Macedonian are in the background there. And she's making her way back to Annapolis to the Naval Academy, where she's going to be a training vessel for midshipmen. That didn't last very long, because last time I gave this talk in Hampton, Virginia, just down the road, when I said this next name, some people actually booed. I'm not kidding. I was at the Old Point Comfort Yacht Club right there at Fort Monroe. You're probably going to guess the name I'm going to say. General Benjamin Butler. They booed. It was the first time. That was so great. Benjamin Butler loves America, covets America. He's a colorful character. He ran for president 3 times in 3 different parties and lost all 3 times. He was the occupier of New Orleans. He was the occupier of Fort Monroe. He was the governor of Massachusetts. He also loved yachts and yachting. And he was very interested in America. And he made some legal maneuvers and some legal claims on the way she was captured and the way she was entered into the Navy. He ends up, by brute force, buying America from the United States government for $5,000. And it becomes his personal yacht, General Benjamin Butler. The good news is he has A, very deep pockets, B, not afraid to spend them on yachts. He is an excellent steward for America. He's an excellent steward. He spends freely. He races her in New York Yacht Club regattas. He cruises her. We know she was in Bermuda cruising with him. We know she was in the Caribbean cruising with him. We know she was at Cuba racing with him. This is a photo under the Butler ownership. Eventually she ends up, this is her during the Spanish-American War, off of Montauk, painted white, slightly different rig configuration. He was constantly tweaking the rig, but here she is off Montauk carrying Spanish-American War troops, recovering troops. Another picture in the Butler era. The 20th century arrives, General Butler dies. His family loves the yacht and are interested in the yacht, but they have a lot of other stuff going on, right? The America was Butler's life. His descendants love her, but not quite as much. She's laid up in Boston, and she's covered in Boston, and the newspaper report at the time said she was tossing mournfully in her slip. No one would have known this was the old famous cup racer of the past. So she enters the new century in Boston, and eventually the descendants of General Butler put her up for sale, and they put ads in the yachting magazines. And who appears to buy America but Sir Thomas Lipton? Challenged 5 times for the America's Cup and never won. Well, this is newsworthy enough it makes it into the New York Times, which is a pretty big deal. If Lipton can't win the cup, he could maybe take back the schooner that got her. This doesn't really come together. A few years later, the word gets out that a group of Portuguese businessmen are interested in buying America, and they want to convert her into a trading packet, maybe to go between the Azores and Portugal and the east coast of the United States as a trading vessel. She maybe still had some life left in her as that was enough, right? Lipton's one thing, but turning her into a trading vessel in the 1920s is enough. Some civic-minded yachtsmen in Boston, out of the Eastern Yacht Club, led by Charles Francis Adams, take up a collection and buy America from the Butler heirs. Their idea is not to get her sailing again, but the idea is to get her shored up and cleaned up and sent to Annapolis again to train midshipmen at the Naval Academy. Great plan. They get her up into shape. Let's cover the trip down to Annapolis. Famous old Yacht America gets ovation as she leaves Boston on final journey. As she made her way from Boston to Annapolis, she stopped at yachting centers along the way. She stops in Newport, she stops in Larchmont, she stops in multiple spots along the way. The coverage in the New York Times was daily as she moved. It was that big of a deal. This is a photo that I love. A very well-known sports photographer in Boston took this, Leslie Jones, and I got in touch with the descendants who gave permission to use it in the book, which was lovely. And I imagine that most of their requests are photos of Ted Williams and Bobby Orr and Boston sports heroes. Not this. I may have been the first one to ever request this, but here's America in September 1921. The editors of Yachting magazine wrote, "Her trip under tow by a Navy submarine chaser from Boston to Annapolis was a sentimental journey with stops at many yachting centers along the way, including Marblehead, Gloucester, Salem, Newport, New Bedford, Newark, and Philadelphia." Here she is again getting towed to Annapolis. In October 1st, 1921, on the deck of America, Charles Francis Adams accepts $1 from the superintendent of the Naval Academy as a token, and the Naval Academy has bought America from this syndicate of yachtsmen. The entire brigade of midshipmen is called out to watch, and America seems to have a good future here in Annapolis. It seems like this is going to be a good plan. She's there. Well, let's be blunt about it. The Naval Academy didn't ask to have, at that point, a 70-year-old wooden schooner. They didn't have a spot for it in their curriculum. They were not training people to sail schooners at that point, right? This is 1920s. The care and upkeep of a 70-year-old wooden schooner that's been ridden hard and put away wet is not insignificant. So America gets docked at Annapolis. This is an aerial view of Annapolis, the Naval Academy over here, the Severn River right here, the Chesapeake Bay down and to the right. Let's zoom in on the Academy. Modern day United States Naval Academy, Bancroft Hall down here for those of you that are familiar. America, this is what the shoreline looks like. It's all landfill from the 50s. America goes right there. They call it right there is where America goes, right on the corner of the track in the modern day. If you were to stand right here and look out from 1921 to 1940, this is what you would have seen. So here's America at the Naval Academy. The masts are not nearly as dramatically raked, as they were, but you can still see that fine stern there, that very racy looking shape to her, that matte black seaplane in the background. You can notice that also. The Naval Academy always had seaplanes going in the river at that point. But America sat here literally, gangplank literally bolted to her deck. Sat here for about 20 years and got minimal maintenance in the water. Didn't get hauled once. Anybody here that's familiar with wooden boats know what happened if you sit in the brackish, sluggish Chesapeake Bay for 20 years in a wooden boat. She did get her bottom recoppered just before she went up there, but she was here. Occasionally, she gets dressed up for occasions. This is 1924, on the anniversary of that race, August 22nd. She gets dressed up. Midshipmen tumble aboard for class photos. I spoke with a couple of gentlemen that were young boys in Annapolis at this time, and they remember climbing aboard and playing pirate on her decks. They said they would be able to climb around and swing on halyards and have sword fights and things on her decks. Pretty neat photo here, 1940 Naval Academy. You can see America right there. Right there. So that's where she sits in present day. So our story will now shift across the creek. So we'll move over here to the Eastport section of Annapolis. And how does America jibe with this? And I'm going to speed up a little bit here, just looking at the time. So in the late 1930s, this was a yacht yard, building and taking care of wooden boats. Coming out of the Depression, it was quite sleepy, but they had a great workforce. They had an excellent leadership. Two very entrepreneurial young men had come down from New York and bought this facility. They named it the Annapolis Yacht Yard. Here it is in that era, 1939. This is what it looked like from the air. This is Spa Creek in the foreground and Back Creek in the background there. This is the peninsula of Eastport. Here's the Annapolis Yacht Yard going right here. Their goal was to build a series of production powerboats. Their goal was to use Detroit-styled production lines and mass-produce the same model over and over and over again. So you can see from this ad. I'm friends now, because of this book, with the descendants of the folks that started the Annapolis Yacht Yard, and they always like this part, because I say, I love their ambition. They were technically in Eastport, Maryland, not even in Annapolis, but they called themselves the Annapolis Yacht Yard, and they had no official connection with the Navy, but they posed with Bancroft Hall in the background here to make it look very, official. They did build a couple of lovely yachts. Here's a 67-footer that they designed and built in Annapolis. Here is a 70-footer. This is the last one they built before the war. So in around 1940, President Roosevelt's son was cruising on his schooner, the Sewanna. He was cruising on the Chesapeake Bay, James Roosevelt. And he stopped at the Annapolis Yacht Yard to have some work done on his schooner. And he was very impressed. And he said to his father, there's a great wooden boat building facility in Annapolis. And Roosevelt, the president, very interested in America, loved Navy history, loved the story of America, got the idea that maybe if we send the old girl across the creek, these guys at the Annapolis Yacht Yard could do some work on her. So on a windy night in December of 1940, on Marine Railway number 1, America is hauled. And right where that yellow rectangle is where she was. And that's what she looks like when she's hauled. And I always mean to crop this picture because it gives away the story, but for the last time she is hauled. She does not go back in the water. So she's hauled out. My friend Lawrence Harchie, a teenager, took this. I said to him, Mr. Harchie, you did an incredible job framing this. You've got the Maryland State Capitol right there, and you've got the Naval Academy Chapel right there, and you've got a photo that looks like a Richard Avedon art photo, like it should be in a rich person's home. And he goes, I was a teenager with a Kodak Brownie camera, so anything you see is luck. And I was like, all right. So the Navy sends air photographers over to take some survey photos, and she's in rough shape. She's in very rough shape. Lots of rotted wood, lots of problems when she came out. One of the men that was on the scene said that she was groaning and complaining when she came out of the water. Another one commented on how bad the smell was when she came out of the water. On the stern, we see Boston as a hailing port, which makes sense because in the Butler era. We also see a small approximation of that wonderful gold eagle that was across her stern. Well, the original one, at some point back in the 1860s, was taken off of her stern and disappeared. And some New York Yacht Club members were at a pub outside of Cowes years later, decades later, and saw it. And the New York Yacht Club bought it, and it's at their clubhouse in Manhattan now, that original eagle that was on her stern. So here's the old girl looking a little bit rough. Well, in the meantime, they begin work. The rumor is that President Roosevelt is pushing for this behind the scenes, but he's smart enough to know, coming out of the Depression, going into a war, the president's not going to get involved in any yacht restoration. That's not a good PR look. But through intermediaries, They're funded and they're encouraged to begin to work on America. Well, the entrepreneurial owners of the Annapolis Yacht Yard know that one, repairing an old schooner isn't going to take care of their whole workforce, and two, production yachts are not going to work during the war. So they get in the business of building warships. So they get first a contract to build submarine chasers. So here's a 110-foot submarine chaser being launched right next to the America into the waters of Spa Creek. They built 10 of these in Eastport, and I went down there being the history, I guess, fan, nerd that I am, and on the same exact day, at the same exact time, and took a photo last year. So that's what that looks like now. So I'll just do that one more time. And that's what it looks like now. So the Annapolis Yacht Yard becomes a juggernaut. They end up building 10 of those 110-foot submarine chasers. They end up building over 100 70-foot patrol torpedo boats out of wood. 400 workers there, working around the clock on 3 shifts, cranking these out. They were sent overseas to the Royal Navy and to the Soviet Navy as part of the Lend-Lease program, the largest private employer in Annapolis. And this really heated up after Pearl Harbor. And you could imagine there's an insatiable appetite for these vessels, but at the same time, this became a real center of wooden boat building and everything that goes along with it, right? So carpenters, electricians, plumbers, designers, carbon copies of the paperwork to go to Washington, employ hundreds of people there. So this is a photo of some patrol torpedo boats underway at Annapolis. Here's another photo of them. Double planked mahogany over oak frames. They ended up making their own plywood on site for some of these flat things, the marine plywood they made. They had to get, as we might say in the business world, very vertically integrated because it was hard to get things during the war. So they ended up having to make as many things on site there as they could at the Annapolis Yacht Yard. This large building that they're in here is called the Big Shed. It still stands in Annapolis, this building that they're in. This is British Patrol Torpedo 21. This is the first PT boat launched at the Annapolis Yacht Yard before her torpedo tubes are installed. But again, the demand for these was insatiable. Not only were they fast and relatively easy to build, not super complicated to build, and a small yacht yard could build them, they were incredibly effective. They could run it over 45 knots. They packed a punch with 2 torpedoes and some guns on deck. Young Navy officers got very interested in taking command of these because it was kind of an independent command. And they became, for lack of a better word, a very sexy vessel in the Navy during World War II. So lots of PR around these patrol torpedo boats. They're being built all around the United States. Higgins is building them down on the Gulf Coast, right? Elko is building them, Hairsoft is building them, and the Annapolis Yacht Yard is building them. So lots of good PR around these patrol torpedo boats. Several different designs being built. The Annapolis vessels are designed by Vosper, a British firm. I think that one's spectacular. So we'll do a quick boat design moment here. This is from now on, which was the last private vessel built at the Annapolis Yacht Yard. And this is a Vosper designed patrol torpedo boat built at the Annapolis Yacht Yard. Both are 70 feet long. Both are double planked mahogany over oak frames. Both have this step, which was one of the Annapolis Yacht Yard's signatures, but here it's being used to clear the torpedo from the hull. Both have an open air helm station, which was known at the time as a bandstand, which is kind of cool. Bandstand. Both have this squared off cabin house. Both have this long flat run aft. So you can see how some of this work in 1939 and 40 fed into this work in 1940, 41, and 42. I thought that was kind of a neat comparison. The letterhead during the war shows their patrol torpedo boats and their best yacht. Don't forget, when the war's over, we're going to build you yachts. They could run at 45, 46 knots, 3 Packard engines in there, incredibly loud, burned up a huge amount of fuel. Some advertising done by the Annapolis Yacht Yard during the war. I'm watching the time here because I got to get back to our schooner. Black & Decker from Baltimore came down and put electrified tools in the hands of the workers, which sped things up quite a bit. So instead of having, they had now had electric hammers. They now had electric screw guns, that sort of thing. So Black & Decker uses them in their advertising. Packard uses it in their advertising, the American monster with the flapping wings. So these are very sexy vessels. The Annapolis Yacht Yard ends up advertising in the yachting magazines during the war. This is February 1943. This is January 1945, Rudder magazine. They end up winning the E Award, which is an efficiency award, big honor. They flew the flag over the yacht yard. In the meantime, America's there in the middle of this, waiting for her rehabilitation. The 24-year-old naval officer in charge, the summer after Pearl Harbor, sends a note off to his supervisor in Washington and says, this is it right here, at the present time, the subject vessel, meaning America, is using space which could be made available for the building of one 110-foot submarine chaser. They request permission to dismantle America until the end of the present emergency. That's the phrase that they use, the present emergency. He told me, I got to interview him before he passed away, the Navy officer, he was a Lieutenant JG at the time. He said it was the fastest reply I ever got in the Navy. He said, I sent that memo to Washington, D.C., and on the other end of the line, Loring Swayze calls, who is his boss's boss's boss. Some of you may remember that name, yacht designer Loring Swayze. He's in the Navy during the war, helping with ship design. And he says, Miller, I have this in front of me, this memo you've just sent about America. Not only no, but hell no. You have to have her ready to be in the water before the winter. And Miller said, I don't understand, sir. You were under so much pressure to build these PT boats and these subchasers. America, it's just, and Swayze answered, Franklin wishes it so. So behind the scenes, Roosevelt is pushing for the America, right? So they do work just enough to show progress on America, but their real focus was building these warships, right? This was their real focus. So this is a reply telling them not to do that. March 1942, America is lying under a makeshift shed, a shed that was made out of corrugated metal and 2x4s. Later, when you hear what I'm about to say next, later one of the real shipbuilders there, one of the yacht builders there said, we were too busy working on the PT boats to build that shed. The house carpenter did that job. Heavy snowstorm on Palm Sunday. We all know that kind of snow where when you get a shovelful, you're like, wow, this is a heavy snowstorm. Shed collapses on America and smashes her. No one was on board at the time. Nobody was in the hull, luckily, or they probably would have been killed. This is what she looked like that morning in the snow. This is after she'd been cleaned up a little bit. The report I had from a couple of folks I talked to that were there on the scene said it was difficult to tell shed material from America material. Here she is again. And again. My understanding is that Roosevelt was never told about this. There are no real records of this other than these few handful of photographs and some oral tradition. So the survey crew didn't come back out to have a look. There was no, what do we have now? So you've got the wreckage of America inside this warship factory. How embarrassing is this? This is the May 2nd, 1942 launch of a patrol torpedo boat. The patrol torpedo boat has just gone in, right off that skid there, into Spa Creek. This is just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. This is happening, right? And you've got Navy officers here. You've got one of the owners of the yacht yard here scooping up some champagne that had just been smashed on the bow. You've got the yard superintendent here laughing. The big shed full of patrol torpedo boats, which we saw, and look at America right here. How embarrassing must this have been? One oak frame in there. That's that progress I talked about to show the president, perhaps. So there's America. Again, I made another one of these to present day. That's what that looks like now. One more. So the Annapolis Yacht Yard becomes, just as I mentioned earlier, an amazing factory. I picked that word on purpose. A trusted partner of the Navy. If you count, there are 12 patrol torpedo boats in various parts of this photo. These are the facilities they're building them in. They started them in this shed, launched them into the creek, pulled them around to this shed, and finished them in the water in this shed. So the finishing shed, that's called. Look with me for a moment at some of these boat building sheds. What do they have in common? Well, there's skylights to let the light in so we don't use a lot of electricity and heat the place up when they're working in there. There's huge openings to move the vessels in and out, right? To move the vessels in and out, huge openings, lots of windows and things. This odd-looking shed right here has no skylights, no windows, only a door for an opening. This is the shed they built around America's wreckage. Padlocked off. One observer later said they covered their shame with that shed. But that's the America shed right there. America spent the war in there. This is what this looks like today. I'll do that again. That's a Chart House restaurant for those of you that have been to Annapolis right there, where you can go and enjoy dinner today or tomorrow. So the war ends. The yacht yard finishes its contracts. The owners eventually sell it to the Trumpy boat building business, and they built boats there into the 1970s using some of the same workers and the same equipment. So what's going to happen to America? Well, the Navy at this point, Roosevelt's dead, the patron's dead, the vessel's clearly a mess. The yacht yard owners are preparing the property for sale, and they want her out of there. So what do? Mystic Seaport had just been founded, and they began to express a little bit of interest. I know the Mariners Museum was happening at that point. Obviously, some of America ended up here. The Naval Academy, is somewhat interested, but mostly in making models out of the wood. So the Annapolis Yacht Yard gets the contract to break up America. And this is the heartbreaker to me. The most economical and expeditious method of scrapping the yacht. In the end, they get a $200 credit for scrap lumber and a $300 credit for the pig iron. So it's viewed as being worth $500. And that is, that's credited back into the contract. This is November 1945. So very inauspiciously, a clamshell crane comes down and crunches into it, loads it into the back of a truck, who hauls it to the city dump and dumps it. And that's what happens to America. Now, bits of the wood made their way out into the community. Souvenir hunters are picking through the rubble. Two young men, and I love this story, went to the dump and asked where the Eastport wood had been dumped, and they were told and given permission, and they went and were pulling out planks of America and taking them back and cleaning them up. Some of the valuable bits ended up here. This has a couple of amazing pieces here. A companionway is here. A beautiful half hull that George Steers made, legend. He wanted to present it to Queen Victoria, but never got a chance. That's literally here. There's several sections of America that ended up here. Other bits of it just ended up out in the community. They made racing trophies out of it. The Severn Sailing Association has a mantle made out of a section of America. Lots of little bits. In 1967, a magazine article said, to this day, bits are pulled out from under porches and proudly shown off to visitors. So that's what happens to America. The Annapolis Yacht Yard never really gets going. As I mentioned, they sold to Trumpy, although I did like this 1946 design. That looks like a $1 million boat you could buy today at a boat show, right? Like a pretty fancy jet boat or something. That one never got built. What happened to those patrol torpedo boats? This one ended up in Ocean City, New Jersey. Anybody ever go there as a kid? It was called the Flying Saucer. Yes, almost every time I talk, somebody remembers that. You would go on vacation and you would strap into this thing and they would take you out and rip you around and do turns and things. That was an Annapolis-built boat. This one, PT 728, is owned by a museum in the Midwest who's restoring it as an Elko, which is much more of a well-known vessel because of PT 109. So I don't love that they're not restoring it as a Vosper, but they are restoring it, which I do love. Couple of reproductions of America I'll focus on. In 1967, the Schaefer Brewing Company sponsored one, working with Sparkman and Stevens, launched up in Maine. She's currently undergoing restoration in Italy. That bottom right photo is a today photo. They have an Instagram account, America 1967, if you're interested in following that one. More of you are probably familiar with this one. This is the 1995 America, which has been on the Chesapeake Bay several times, and I'm told it's coming back this summer. This was built in 1995 in Albany, New York, and is Coast Guard certified to carry 85 passengers. So this is in Key West. This is in San Diego. This goes to the America's Cup events sometimes. This is on the East Coast sometimes. It's an incredible vessel, but I will point out, that lovely stern that I pointed out multiple times now is a little bit bulkier. She's got 2 diesel engines in there, and she's got an owner's stateroom in there. But just if you want the America experience, this is a spectacular way to go. And that is it till the questions. So thank you very much. Thank you.